Hopefully everybody is making their way into the webinar room. A beautiful sunny morning, which is a nice change from the last few days. But I want to welcome you, all of you, to the Eagleton Institute of Politics, the morning after program. It was perhaps a quicker night last night than most of us expected, but I don't think the names were a shock. We will get into all of that as we go forward here. Before we do that, I want to give you some introductory information. First, I wanted to say that this program, the morning after program, is one of, I think, the most important and special traditions here at the Eagleton Institute of Politics, where we gather the morning after every New Jersey primary or general election, just to talk a little bit about what we saw last night. It's sort of the proverbial water cooler here, the coffee machine, where we can give some top line thoughts on what it is that we saw, what it means for New Jersey, what we may see in the coming months as we get ready for the general election. So my name is Kristoffer Shields. I am an assistant research professor here at Eagleton. I am currently the interim director of the Eagleton Science and Politics program, but I'm also the director of the Eagleton Center on the American Governor. So I have obviously been following very closely this primary, which I think is one of the most interesting primary seasons that we've had in New Jersey in a very long time, certainly since I've lived here, which is going on 2 decades. But I think you really have to go back to maybe 1981 to find a gubernatorial primary, at least as interesting as this one. Maybe not coincidentally enough, the last time there was no line in a gubernatorial race, but we'll get to that as well. We, of course, have our nominees now on the Republican side. Former member of the New Jersey Assembly, Jack Ciattarelli, who was also the nominee 4 years ago, will be running for the Republicans. And on the Democratic side, U.S. Representative Mikey Sherrill, which sets up for what I think is a really interesting fall general election between 2 New Jersey political heavyweights. So that should be really interesting. Lucky for you all, unlike my students, you don't have to just listen to me for the next hour talk about this stuff. We have gathered a truly remarkable panel for you. The way this is going to work, I'll introduce our panelists quickly here now. Then we're going to give each of them a couple minutes just to give us their thoughts on whatever they want to talk about from last night, whatever they saw, whatever they learned, whatever surprised them, whatever it is that they want to sort of talk about. Then I'll be back to ask a few questions to them, digging a little bit more deeply maybe on some of those issues and some others that come up. And certainly for all of you, for all of our viewers, if you have questions, you can see the Q&A button down there at the bottom of your Zoom screen. If you could put them in the Q&A, we will try to get to as many of those questions as we can. I will say straight up from the front that we are going to leave some time at the end for your questions. I will also try to kind of pepper them in with mine as they come in, particularly if they're similar to what I was going to ask. We will get to as many as we possibly can, but with just under an hour left, I don't want to make promises I can't keep. So we probably will unfortunately not get to all of your questions. But what I will promise is that we'll at least be able to scratch the surface here and get a conversation started that's going to go on for the next 5 months. And we'll certainly be having lots of opportunities, lots of programs for you to attend and ask some questions. And I know all of our panelists will be out and about all over the place over these next 5 months. So anything we don't get to today, hopefully we'll get to next time. So without further ado, let me introduce you to these incredible panelists that we have here today. Starting with our journalist, senior political correspondent David Cruz is the moderator of Chatbox and Reporters Roundtable. He has been a member of the New Jersey Spotlight News team since 2011 and has been covering New Jersey's biggest stories for almost 30 years now. He is he's been a reporter and moderator of public affairs programs on television, radio, and digital for WBGO and WNYC Radio, and is the former editor-in-chief of the Hudson Reporter newspaper groups. David, it's terrific to have you here.
Thank you.
Next is Missy Balmir, is a seasoned government affairs and strategic planning professional with over 2 decades of experience working at the intersection of government, community, and politics. Her career spans key leadership roles across New Jersey's public sector, including serving as municipal and state government administrator, a senior advisor at the federal level, and a campaign operative. And I will add, she is an important mentor to our Eagleton Graduate Fellows in the Eagleton Graduate Fellows program. So Missy, it's terrific to see you this morning. Next up is Dale Florio. Dale brings over 3 decades of public affairs experience to the service of his clients with a highly successful track record at all levels of government. Florio is widely recognized as one of the most influential public affairs professionals in the Garden State. In fact, PPAG, Princeton Public Affairs Group, has been consistently named New Jersey's #1 lobbying firm, excuse me, for the last 20 years in a row. And Dale, too, is a terrific friend of the Eagleton Institute of Politics, and it's great to see you again, Dale. And then last but certainly not least, Julia Sass Rubin is the Associate Dean of Academic Programs and the Director of the Public Policy Program at the Edward J. Bloustein School of Planning and Public Policy here at Rutgers, New Brunswick. Amongst many other things, Professor Rubin served as an expert witness in the successful lawsuit brought by Senator Andy Kim last year, right? I've lost track of time a little bit, but I believe last year, to eliminate New Jersey's county line primary ballot, which is certainly something that we'll be talking with Professor Rubin about today. So thank you all so much for being here today. And we'll just stick in that same, no particular order, just to get, like I said, your general thoughts about last night. If you can keep it to 2-3 minutes, that'll leave us more time for questions. But David, why don't you get us started on what it is that you saw last night?
Sure. I think, during the day yesterday, people were calling and texting and asking who I thought was going to win on either side. And I said, well, the conventional wisdom is it'll be Cheryl and Chitterelli, not believing that it was going to be that simple, particularly on the Democratic side. But before about 45 minutes in, they called the race for Cheryl after having called it for Chitterelli at 12 minutes after the hour. And I was like, it was a pretty conventional night. If this were any other year, we would have said it's going to be Cheryl and Chitterelli, and that would have been it. We would have 1 hour coverage instead of 3.5 hours of coverage. But I think a couple of things showed for us, and as we were saying yesterday, it's going to take a while to figure out what this all means, the fact that there's no party line and how candidates decide to run and so on. But by and large yesterday, I think the machine, the Democratic organizations, showed that they can still muster the muscle to get their candidate across. The money, the boots on the ground, all that stuff that organizations had, plus the line. The only thing that they didn't have this year going into the race. And so I will just say that I didn't think that Mikey Sherrill's campaign was that great. She had, I think, the best name recognition going into the race, but she, I guess you could best describe it as the best offense is a good defense. They didn't have any major flubs. None of the attacks, which were late and kind of weak, really landed on her. And I think that in retrospect, yeah, it was going to be Mikey Sherrill all along. And that's what it was. I will say, and maybe we'll talk about this in a little bit, but Ras Baraka was to me the star of this entire play. Not only because he's sometimes thrilling to watch, but also because he brought up stuff that not only the other candidates couldn't and didn't bring up, but he was the only one who could bring it up with some real, those issues up with some real credibility. And I think that that showed, and I mean, got 160,000 votes. Nobody would have called that way back when this all started. So, and lastly, it was an impressive field. I mean, you had 3 mayors, 2 members of Congress, a former Senate president. And so that was really encouraging, I think, for anybody who watches this sort of stuff. So that's just my quick assessment.
Thank you very much, David. Missy.
One, I would echo David's point that it was incredibly encouraging that we had these great candidates running on the Democratic side. And, some of the takeaways as of right now, right, because there's still a lot of information that we need to sift through, is that I thought that competitive primaries help with turnout on the Democratic side. We saw a lot of engagement from all of the candidates, using all the resources that they had at their disposal to some extent, to really talk about democratic principles and why they were the best candidates to ensure that New Jersey stayed in the blue column, right? And having the benefit of that conversation with Democratic voters early is incredibly important. So the fact that the one thing we know for sure is that there is a benefit to turnout by having these competitive primaries. Another thing that I thought was interesting that I'm still kind of sifting through is the idea from the party leadership. They may be more cautious to change candidates in this environment because, of the benefits of incumbency. And it was something that you could, forego because of the line. And now that you don't have the line, when you open it up to a new candidate, and I would anticipate that there's going to be more competitive primaries going forward. So there'll be some caution, I would think, before making decisions to change out sitting members in the legislature. But those are kind of my initial thoughts. I would say and also in response to Mr. Cruz, there are many of us who are not surprised by Bloustein performance or the number of votes that he received. It is not a surprise at all. So I think the question now is, how do we all come together from the Democratic side? Because that is what's going to be required for us to win in November. So how do all of these various fractions within the Democratic Party find a center landing, right? Not just about the candidate, but on various issues that still provides that same level of excitement that we saw on the Roswell Rocket side. We need that. Mikey's going to need that. And so it's going to be interesting to see going forward how we come together as a party.
Excellent. Thank you, Missy. Dale, what did you take away from last night?
Hey, listen, I was thrilled, absolutely thrilled. I won the office pool. I picked both candidates. I mean, the Republican one was probably a little bit easier, but I was the only one in the office that had Mikey winning by more than 8 points. Everybody else had it within like the margin of error. And that's because, data research, all of that is harder and harder, right? It's harder to really tell. So everybody thought this was close. But I don't know. Anyway, I picked it with 8 points plus, and it was even more than that. I'm not sure that we can take a lot away from this campaign relative to the impact of the line or not, because you had, with the public financing, right? You had most of the candidates were relatively well funded, right? So they had a chance to get their message out. They could get beyond the party line. I mean, Mikey Sherrill did reasonably well down in Camden, right? But she had money. I spent a lot of time in South Jersey at a shore home, and I saw a ton of her commercials along with Josh Gottheimer. So I think where the line will come into play more often down the road will be kind of what Missy referenced, and that's the legislative level, the county level. But as long as we have public financing and you have candidates' ability to raise money, I don't know that the line will matter, as much. I guess my one last comment, just looking at this morning's NJ Spotlight breakout of both the Republican and the Democratic primary, if not that it automatically falls that way, but when you look at what Mayor Baraka and Mayor Fulop generated in terms of percentage of the vote, if I'm Congresswoman Sherrill, I'd be kind of thankful that both of them were actually in the race, because it clearly throughout the Democratic primary, everybody was kind of moving and trying to capture a lane, right? And arguably, both of those candidates kind of were more to the more liberal end of the Democratic Party, and they obviously grabbed a fair amount of votes. If it was only one of them in that race, it might have been a tighter race. She still might have pulled it out, but clearly a tighter race.
Yeah, thanks. Julia, what are you thinking this morning?
Yes, thank you. Lots of great stuff already out there. So I'm going to disagree with David, which I don't generally like to do. I actually think that I actually think that this primary suggests that the end of the county line means that the county party organizations can no longer select the winner and that candidates really matter. In other words, we're becoming like other states, which is a good thing. So there have been a number of changes just in the last few months since the new primary ballot law was enacted. We've certainly seen more high-profile candidates with a legitimate chance of winning, as others have pointed out already. And candidates didn't drop out if they don't get endorsed, i.e. Sweeney dropped out in 2017, right? So high-profile candidate. This time around, they all stayed in. But I think what was most key from last night is that the endorsed candidates lost 9 counties, 6 Democratic and 3 Republican. And those counties include strong Democratic machine counties like Camden, Essex, and Union, and strong Republican machine counties like Ocean. So to understand just how much of an earthquake that is, no Democratic gubernatorial candidate who had the county line has lost in this century. And only 3 Republican candidates lost while on the county line over the last 20 years. And all of those were in pretty weak Republican counties. In other words, they were democratically controlled counties like Middlesex, Mercer. So there's also 5 assembly seats so far. As Missy said, we're waiting for the results to continue. But so far, there are 5 assembly seats where the endorsed candidates are losing. And that includes an incumbent who's losing right now. The last time an incumbent assembly member lost while running on the line was 22 years ago. And 2 candidates with no endorsement for governor are winning 3 counties, Ras Baraka and Sean Spiller. So I think that's the big takeaway for me, is that not having the line is a huge earthquake. Yes, Cheryl is still winning, but candidate quality still matters. Cheryl is the only woman in the race. She is the neither too progressive, no too conservative candidate. So she picks up a lot in that lane, and she certainly had sufficient funding. Just a couple other observations, as I think someone mentioned, voter participation was up substantially. The votes are not final, but it's already up more than 6 percentage points from 2017, which was the last primary that we had for governor without an incumbent. Because when you have actually competitive primaries, voters show up. Another observation is that money did not seem to matter. Even though it was the most expensive New Jersey primary ever, the candidates who spent the most, Gottheimer, Fulop, Spiller, did not do particularly well. And Baraka, who had the least amount of ad spending and not a lot of funds overall, had an incredible night. Another point that Dale made, which I completely agree with, is that if Baraka and Fulop were one candidate, they would have won. And if you add in Spiller, who I argue was also running as a progressive, they would have had 47% of the vote as of this morning. In contrast, the 2 more conservative candidates, Gottheimer and Sweeney, had a combined 19% of the vote as of this morning. So if I were advising Cheryl, I would, to get to Missy's point about how do you bring the party together, and I'm not a Democratic or Republican strategist, but just as an observer, I would say think hard about asking Baraka to be your lieutenant governor, because what Democrats need, if you judge it by the 2024 general election, is someone who can bring in young voters and voters of color and, energize people. And I don't think that's enough for Mikey right now. I think she needs that kind of energy, and he would bring that. So let me stop with that.
Excellent. Well, thank you all very much. There's a lot to get into here, and hopefully we'll be able to get into quite a bit of it. I think also, Julia, the early voting made a difference in terms of voter turnout. This time it was heartening to see higher numbers for a primary than we usually do. Still not as high as we'd like, right? But getting better. Let's start though by going a little bit deeper on both the Republican and Democratic primaries and the nominees. And maybe we'll start on the Republican side. In the Republican primary, Bill Spadea, Jack Ciattarelli both spent a lot of time this spring kind of tussling with each other over that same lane, right? Trying to get President Trump's endorsement, which Jack Ciattarelli ultimately got, and sort of working in more of that, I would argue, MAGA Republican lane. Whereas John Bramnick was maybe your more traditional New Jersey Republican. He, of course, was under 10%. Last night. Is there Does that tell us anything about the future of the Republican Party in New Jersey? Certainly, Republicans have picked up ground in New Jersey over the last couple of election cycles. Does it tell us, A, anything about the future of the Republican Party in New Jersey? And then maybe B, more immediately, what is Ciattarelli going to do in the fall? Does he continue to align himself with Donald Trump? Does Donald Trump come to New Jersey to do events? Or does he move away from that as we get to the fall election season? Any predictions on any of that? And maybe Dale, will start with you on that.
So, listen, I mean, it's going to be no different than Congresswoman Cheryl having to wear the mantle of Phil Murphy, right? I mean, I'm sure he'll endorse her, and she's going to have to talk about state issues, right? Jack Ciattarelli and then the campaign sought the nomination. He is the president of the United States. There are a lot of things that they agree on, but you'll hear, I assume you'll hear from the Ciattarelli campaign talking about state issues. It'd be no different if you had a Democrat in the White House. Party folks stick together, and so the campaign, I know, was happy to get the endorsement. I'm not sure that it was ever in doubt. It was a matter of when, and so and Jack was proud to get the endorsement. It was 3 weeks in. I think the campaign's polling already saw Jack with a sizable lead, but I think for observers, people on the outside, the president's endorsement just solidified what we were already seeing in the polling, that Jack was moving in the right direction and was building a significant lead, over Bill Spadea. So you asked about the changing of the Republican Party. Typically, the party reflects the White House and your gubernatorial candidate. New Jersey's probably Republican Party. I would call it a bit more moderate, but they're supporting the president, and the goal here now coming out of a primary, and that's the problem the Democrats will also have to face. Both Cheryl and Ciattarelli are going to consolidate, right? Consolidate, get the party to work in unison. I mean, it's never easy, and you'll never get everybody rowing in the same direction, but that's a challenge for both campaigns.
Any other thoughts on that?
Yeah, I would. What's going to be interesting to Dale's point is that both have to figure out how to add, right, to what they have currently done in terms of the voters that in their parties that have come out in support of them. So, the largest group is the unaffiliated voter, and they both need some of those votes in order to win, and they need to keep their coalition of their parties intact while they do so. So that's going to be the challenge for both candidates. For Cheryl, obviously, the idea that, as noted, the progressive part of the party is engaged and excited, and turnout is there, but the number still isn't enough to win by itself in a general. So you then have to expand, right? We always talk about it's about addition. You have to expand, and where are you going to go to get those voters? Typically, it's going to be unaffiliated. Unaffiliated voters are not going to be as far left or progressive as the partisan primary voter. Similarly, on the Republican side, you're going to have the more MAGA voters that came out in the primary, but there are going to be some unaffiliated voters that are not going to be interested in being that far to the right or conservative or a MAGA Republican. So how do they strike that balance is going to be interesting to see over the next 6 months.
I think for Jack Ciattarelli, maybe not the best thing that could have happened to him, but it wouldn't have hurt him much, I think, if he didn't get the Trump endorsement, because all indications were that he had a pretty good lead before he got the endorsement, because he's going to have to be pretty deft at both owning the Trump endorsement and saying that he loved it and wanted it, and then telling particularly independent voters, unaffiliated voters, that that's a good thing. I don't think that he needed it, and I don't think that it's going to help him particularly in the fall. It may rally some of his base, maybe, But in the general, I don't think it helps him at all. And it's clear from yesterday's victory speeches that, Chitterelli is going to be the candidate of Trump and Cheryl is going to be the candidate of Murphy. And that's how I think they're going to position themselves. Of course, the wild card is, the things could catch fire. The economy could tank, riots could spread, any number of things could happen that will affect what happens in this race. I think that Missy is right, is that in that Cheryl has a progressives deficit. I don't think that Baraka is the answer. Baraka would just showcase how much better a candidate he was than Cheryl and just diminish her further. In oratory alone, but also in focus on issues that, you have to call them non-traditional issues because they don't talk about them in elections, but he has that over her, and it would just highlight the difference between them. So, in that regard, that's my thoughts on that.
So I'm going to give advice to, as I said, either campaign. I am not a campaign strategist, but I don't think lieutenant governors get a lot of campaign time. So to the degree that, to David's point about Baraka upstaging Cheryl, I think that probably wouldn't be as much of an issue. But he certainly would bring energy, which she needs. And I think what the 2024 campaign highlighted is that you can't just rely on people coming out because of Trump. You're right, David. It could be that in 6 months it's such a disaster, or 5 months, that people will come out and vote. But I do think that there is a lot of disengagement, and that may be what we're seeing in the shift to unaffiliated in the registration. The registration advantage that the Democrats have right now is actually exactly the same as it was 8 years ago. It's about 800,000. So what happened, of course, is with 2020, it picked up quite a bit, and they exceeded the unaffiliated. Right now, unaffiliated are exactly at the same level as they were 8 years ago. What's interesting is you've had a tripling of all other parties, so the Greens, the Libertarians, et cetera. And so what we don't know is how much of that vote and how much of the unaffiliated are people who are just dissatisfied with the status quo. Maybe they'll come out and vote for Democrats, and maybe they just won't vote, right? They need some energizing. And I think what's interesting about this campaign is it felt very much like a reform campaign. It wasn't so much about the issues to the degree that you had a message. Baraka and Fulop, for example, the message was reform. It was against the status quo. And so having that on a candidate like Cheryl, who's maybe perceived as pretty status quo, could be quite helpful. That's the last of my party advice.
Also,
how does, we talked about, Jack Ciattarelli sort of and walking that line with Donald Trump. How does Mikey Cheryl sort of respond to that, right? How does she, and as part of that question, we've talked about, David, you and I have talked about this being a bellwether, right, for the National Democratic Party. And certainly the National Democrats have not been, shall we say, unified, right, in terms of how to respond to the Trump administration. Are there any national lessons that come out of yesterday? Is there anything that you think comes out of this primary that both sort of informs how Mikey Cheryl approaches the general election, but also how national Democrats approach the Trump administration?
I don't think so. I think that this was very much primaries, and the Democrats are dealing with whatever their internal Democratic conflicts and issues are. I think maybe after the general, you might see some examples of how the Democrats decided to deal with Trump. Right now, they suck at it. They're really just terrible, and I don't think it bodes well for the fall. I think that the progressives are not really hot for Mikey Cheryl, and she didn't seem to really want to embrace them, despite 100 opportunities that she had during the campaign to say something that would, appeal to progressives. She hedges on a lot of things. She hedged on the Immigrant Trust Act. Her affordable housing plans are kind of unclear. We asked her once about this pending suit on New Jersey's segregated schools, and she totally whiffed and started talking about how wonderful it is to have nice classrooms for kids of all colors to be in. I mean, that's not a response that's going to motivate progressives to come to her side. So I think the Democrats got to figure out their own stuff before they can figure out how they're going to deal with Trump. And in the process of figuring out their own stuff, they may not be able to deal with Trump, who seems to be, the more outlandish he is, the more attention he gets, and the harder it unfortunately becomes for Democrats to attack him.
Yeah, there's definitely been a bit of a normalizing of the Trump antics, right? So there's the tolerance for it, unfortunately, is higher than we would like it to be, particularly on the Democratic side. I think for Sherelle, she's going to have to, the campaign's going to make a decision about how they want to win, right? Are you going to win by driving up the stalwarts in the party, the communities of color, who aren't always extremely progressive, as a note, but the communities of color, the progressives of the party really figuring out what to do, and that drives that vote up enough to win? Or do you moderate enough to add the numbers you need from the unaffiliated voter? And that ultimately, there'll be the time where they're trying to do both, but at some point, a decision point is going to be made where they're going to make a decision on how they are going to choose to try to win in November. So obviously, I advise Professor Rubin, I advise politicians all the time. They don't always listen, but I would say it has to be a balance, because we can't do it without the entire coalition of voters on the Democratic side. There's going to need to be a balance, because we can't afford, and what we can't afford also is for people to sit it out because of their lack of motivation, which is obviously always the danger on the Democratic side as well.
We see this all the time, and it shifts from cycle to cycle. So we're in this gubernatorial cycle now. You'll have one party wants to nationalize the election, and then the other party wants to make it a local election. I think Ciattarelli's been pretty clear about the things that he supports Donald Trump on, but not a whole lot of those things really pertain to everyday life here in New Jersey, and that's what governor's candidates need to talk about. I think that's what made Baraka and Fuller pretty effective in those debates. I mean, when you're the mayor of a large city, I mean, you're dealing with all kinds of issues. I mean, they were able to really talk in depth about very specific issues. That's what I think people in this campaign are going to want to hear about from both candidates. So if I'm Cheryl, I'm going to nationalize this. If I'm Ciattarelli, I support the president. He supports me. This is what we need to do for New Jersey. So you're going to see more of a localization conversation. And whoever can do that the best wins. I mean, I would think that there's a chance that people are calling this a very competitive race, and absolutely it's going to be. But I would think the people of New Jersey want to hear about, okay, how are we going to fix? What do we need to do here in New Jersey to kind of move on from where we are? Whoever, as I said, whoever does that best will win.
I agree. My personal opinion is that the race will be run on those state issues, particularly affordability, as we get into the fall. I do, though, want us to remember, for me to remember, particularly, as I said, Director of Assembly, American Governor, a governor's not the only race on the ballot in New Jersey this fall. The entire Assembly, of course, also up this fall. What are your take on the key Assembly races? Was there anything in those races that surprised you last night? Which are the ones that we should pay attention to? And this sort of idea that New Jersey is becoming more purple, or has moved to the right over the last couple of election cycles. One of our viewers asked about this. Is that likely to show up, do you think, in the assembly races? Are Republicans going to be able to pick up some seats, even flip the chamber, which seems less likely to me, but certainly possible? How do you see the assembly sort of shaking out as we head into those general election races? I'll let anyone jump in on that one. So.
I will say that I mean, I haven't followed them very closely, having focused on the governor's race, but I don't see anything that jumped out at me to make me think certainly that the Republicans are going to flip the chamber. But I will note that the last time Republicans picked up some seats in the assembly was when Chitterelli ran, and he mentioned that yesterday. And you know, that's the hope, at least on their part. I don't know if that's, I mean, it's obviously the goal, but it's certainly the hope.
Yeah, I think when you look at polling, and pollsters always, state moving in the right direction, wrong direction. Kind of the last set of polls that I've seen, and in New Jersey, we're tough, by the way, right? So things are always not moving in the direction we want them to move in, but I think we're below 50%. But that's just kind of a New Jersey thing. I think a lot of these assembly races will drift one way or the other, depending on the strength of the top of the ticket. Now, you also have to remember that from a legislative redistricting standpoint, we really only have 5, maybe 6 districts that are actually competitive. And so it would be very difficult for the Republicans to take control of the assembly, even with a very strong top of the ticket. Even if everything went right, the districts are not very competitive. And as I said, I'm even being generous talking about 6 districts. I mean, there's probably really 3 or 4. And if things really went crazy, you could get to maybe 5 or 6. But as David pointed out, in 21, the Republicans did pick up 6 seats in the assembly, and then they proceeded to lose them, right? The next cycle. So I would say as goes the gubernatorial candidates, so will go the assembly races.
I would agree with that. I do think it's a little bit early to call on the assembly races. We have a lot of very close races, as I think Missy pointed out earlier. But right now, as I noted earlier, there are at least 5 seats where the endorsed candidates are losing, and it looks like there may be more, depending on how the next week goes in terms of vote counting. So that's quite a big shakeup. That is not typical at all for New Jersey. And that could change the tenor of the assembly because they are not beholden to the county leadership, and they may be more willing to make waves. That doesn't speak so much to the general election. I'm focusing on those counties where it's a pretty safe Democratic or Republican incumbent, and it's actually all Democrats. I don't think there were that many contested Republican assembly seats. So to Dale's point, we have a lot of very safe districts. And if you have a turnover in some of those districts, which is very likely based on what we have right now in the vote count, and you have these outsiders coming in who, again, are not beholden, I think that could really have an impact on the New Jersey legislature. And this is only the first cycle post county line. If people understand that they can now win without the endorsement, and the funding obviously is not an issue because the money did come in for non-endorsed candidates, you're going to see that continue cycle after cycle. So what does that mean in the kind of legislation that gets proposed and gets enacted in the state? I think that's a really interesting and unknown at this point, but certainly a big, big change.
Can you actually lay that out for us, Julia? Because that was sort of going to be my next question. Is for those of us, we hear a lot about the line, right? And we heard a lot about how the line was not part of this election. But I think we think about it a lot, or have talked about it a lot, in terms of the gubernatorial race, right? And maybe not as much in terms of the assembly races or even county races, local races, where it may be even more important.
Yes.
For those who are listening who just sort of hear about the line, can you tell us why it's so important, particularly at those sort of local levels or at the assembly level?
So, well, historically, of course, New Jersey, with the exception of that short period in the 80s, as you mentioned, Chris, has had a county line for decades and decades where voters saw in all but a couple of counties, saw a list of candidates that was visually very attractive because they were all together. All the positions were generally being contested by them, and they are led by the most well-known candidate that cycle, the Senate, governor, etc. And we know from historical data that it was a very, very powerful tool for the county organizations. I think you're right that it's particularly powerful for lower level positions because people tend to know the candidates for governor or Senate or president. They often do not know who their congressperson is, let alone who their assembly or Senate representative is. And so the party's ability to influence them is much greater. And this was a really strong visual influence. And so that's why, to me, it's really striking. I mean, the gubernatorial results are incredibly powerful in terms of people winning off without the endorsement. But I think in many ways, the assembly is even more powerful because people don't generally know their assembly candidates. And the fact that we're looking at some substantial shakeups, if current trends continue, is very telling.
I just want to add to, I think once it kind of plays itself out, there's going to be specific stories behind each of those cases where there's been a flip. I can say off the top of my head, just knowing some of the races and the individuals in the races, why those races flipped. I think that the apparatus of the party mechanism is still strong and in place. And what it's going to I think, yield is legislators doing their job differently as it relates to their districts. Because there was a lack of engagement often because it wasn't always necessary to do. Because, the line existed. So there's some of the retailness of campaigning or just governing and serving that may not have been in place in the way that it should have been in place. I would venture to say you're going to see more legislators be more active, and the more active that they are, coupled with the mechanisms of, and I hate to use the word machine, but the mechanism of the party apparatus will still yield a strong outcome for the party. In the places where we see the flips happening, there's a story behind those locations. Just as a note, there's a story. So I just want to be cautious about kind of the overarching kind of thinking about, because none of the people, even the individuals who ran for governor, none of those individuals were outside of the party apparatus, were outsiders per se. Even though they presented themselves as that, more often than not, they had been very much so engaged in party activity. They may not have been for the gubernatorial race. So I want to caution about kind of just what that means. I think it will yield to better governing in that folks are going to have to make sure that they are known by their constituents in order to ensure that they will be easily reelected.
I think Missy makes a good point about the potential in the future for these candidates, successful candidates, to focus on the district because it's a different kind of ball game now. But I think the conflict there is that it's been my experience that everyone's a reformer until they become an incumbent. And I think that the party still has the apparatus to force you, to encourage you, to motivate you to maintain the line. And so, what impact this new kind of landscape will have on what kind of legislation comes out of these districts and these representatives will be interesting, because once you're in the assembly, you got to start coalition building now. And, how did you get into the assembly? Did you buck the system to get into the assembly? Is there residual bad feelings about how you got your seat? Those are all kind of things that, as we've all said, we're going to have to see as they evolve over the next couple of cycles.
If I may just, I don't disagree with Missy that and David that there were special circumstances in some of these races, but there's always special circumstances. And the pattern is really quite different than in prior cycles. So there is a lot of that can be attributed to the fact that people are not being told exactly how to vote when they look at their ballot because there's no county line. And I also agree that becoming an incumbent can change things, but we saw from some of the incredibly unpopular bills that went through the legislature over the last couple of years, Oprah, the Election Transparency Act, that when the leadership says vote this way, most legislators vote that way because they haven't had to worry about their constituents. And if you look at who didn't vote for those bills, they were in those districts that were more purple or more a question mark, as Dale pointed out, the handful of districts that are actually competitive. So if there's an understanding that you can't assume you're going to get re-nominated in the primary because it's no longer a given, and you have to actually go out and talk to your constituents, that also probably makes you less willing to vote against their wishes, one hopes anyway, when those tough votes come up. And that would be an earthquake for New Jersey.
And I think it resonate both ways too, like in terms of what the policy. So there may be progressive things that don't move, or there may be more conservative things that don't move. So I think it's it'll play itself out, but legislatively, it's going to be interesting to see how the things that we want that are the right things to do, though they may not be popular, those things will be impacted as well.
I was a party chairman for 18 years, so understand what I'm about to say. The greatest demon to our democracy is the redistricting process. We wouldn't even be talking about the party line if we had an effective redistricting process. And I'm not talking about just New Jersey. I'm talking about other states, because the districts are what they are. They're very, very safe. And I can look to the districts in New Jersey that are competitive, and the incumbents typically work the hardest. I see them out. They really focus in on the legislation that they're getting behind. It makes them better. Now, again, as a party chairman, if I put the other hat on, I'd say, keep the party line. But so redistricting has its benefits because I think it just makes our elected officials better. I know that's not going to change the party line. I think to be determined. And there's been a lot of great comments here today, so I'll just leave it at that.
But along those lines, and I want to move. I have one more question, but maybe I'll hold it because I want to move to some of our viewer questions. And there's one here that I think is relevant to what we're talking about. Where he says first he'd like to thank Professor Rubin for her research, which I think we would all agree with as well, the work that she's done. But he's asking about, and it's a point that you made as well, Dale, about competition mattering in the primary. Why it matters to have competitive primaries. And what I would point out is where we started, which is the last one in my mind that was this sort of competitive with this many candidates was 1981, where there wasn't the line. So that's probably not a coincidence, right? Maybe there's some coincidence there, but it's probably not entirely a coincidence. So if losing a line creates more competitive primaries, I guess, first of all, do you think that it will? And second of all, if that's a good thing, why is that a good thing?
Well, absolutely it will, right? I mean, as long as you have, especially at the gubernatorial level, you have public financing. I think Julia, maybe Missy mentioned it, but when you have public financing, there was no reason for any of the gubernatorial candidates, especially on the Democratic side, to drop out. They're going to take their shot. I think we'll increasingly see more primaries at the local level, and it's going to, again, I think it will encourage our elected officials at those levels, be it Democrat or Republican. They're going to have to get out there and get known, right? Like Missy was talking about, and that's a good thing. It's a good thing for the people that they serve. So often, you get selected by your local organization, and I'm not sure you fully understand what you've got yourself into because you really don't have to work as hard. So absolutely is the case.
I just want to point out we've had public financing for multiple cycles. The competitive primaries are really more closely correlated to the fact that no one has to drop out because the endorsement doesn't bring the kind of weight it used to because there's no county line.
I think the psyche of the candidate it's like contributed to folks just feeling because we could have, to your point, had multiple candidates in previous elections, you know, in 17, so you could have stayed in the race, right? But I think there's something about the psyche of the candidates that has changed as a result of the line being moved. People who felt that they wanted to see better representation. I mean, there's a district, I'm looking at some numbers that someone put in that I've been watching this particular district, where there was an issue of representation. It had always been an issue of representation. So now folks feel a little bit more encouraged to challenge the fact that there wasn't proper representation in that district. And they might not have done it had the line still existed.
But Julia, I would just say on your point, you're right. We've had public financing for a good bit of time here. But if you go through the convention season, which had been the norm, right? January, February, March, prior to the filing deadline, and you came out of that season with maybe 2 conventions that you won where you got the endorsement. I mean, unless you're independently wealthy, you're not going to win, right? The line typically was that strong. So the big difference here is no party line, and coupled with public financing. So,
speaking of financing, we have a question here about money, and it's certainly well sort of publicized that this was the most expensive gubernatorial primary in New Jersey history. The question that came in is how much did commercial spending, as opposed to policy, have an impact on the results? This question is about for the Democratic candidates. We could ask it for the Republicans as well. And I would add, is that just the future? I mean, it's no secret, right, that money in politics is growing and continues to grow. Do you think that this primary was an outlier in terms of spending in New Jersey, or is this the new normal as we move forward and it's just going to get bigger and bigger?
I think I mentioned earlier, I don't actually see a relationship between spending and performance, which is really surprising because we know from the literature generally it does have an impact. But if you look at the top spenders, they did not have a great night last night on the Democratic side. And overall, the top spenders actually. And to your second, so that's very encouraging in many ways. I do think that we are in the era of big funding nationally. So there's no reason why New Jersey should be different. And when you have a competitive primary, in addition to the public financing, as Dale pointed out, you have a real uptick in small donors. And when you have an engaged population and a really engaging primary, you're going to see dollars flow in. Even if you take out the 40 million that Sean Spiller had, which I think was maybe a one-time deal where you had a super PAC with that kind of investment. But still, you know, it's still a pretty substantial amount of money that was flowing. But again, it didn't seem to make much of a difference, which is really stunning, right? You're a political science, Chris. You know how counter to the literature that runs.
Say part of the spending, though it didn't make a difference for those individual candidates, it did make people aware of an election. It made people aware that, you know, there is a primary, because it could have easily, you know, if you don't have that much engagement in spending, even though they may have been talking about their particular candidacy, but it made people aware. So it still served the benefit of awareness that there is an election. So I may have gotten a bazillion pieces of mail from a candidate that I'm not going to vote for, but I do know that there's an election. So let me go decide who I'm going to vote for. Right. So I think I would say that that's another piece to take into consideration. And the spending is going to continue because it is expensive to communicate. There's a lot of noise. Earned media is difficult, if at all present. So you have to. It's an unfortunate reality that the spending has to happen. And not every candidate is a Ras Baraka. And I do think he is a special candidate. If you are a special candidate, then you have the ability to work around not having the resources, because you have the ability to use, you know, social media and other things. You know, when you have Beyonce says your poem at her tour, right? That is a special situation. And he was special prior to that. But the point being, you have the ability to circum the financing. It's not the end all be all, but it is a factor. And it certainly will be a factor in November.
one thing that we need to separate out is the difference between candidate financing.
All the candidates
all the candidates participated in the public financing program, which meant that a big chunk of the money was coming in from super PACs, and that money, as we know, depending on the type of super PAC, doesn't get reported right away. We may not see it for some time. So that's a big difference that we've seen here in the last, 15 years, where super PACs have really become a big part of the whole campaign process. But from a public financing standpoint, everybody participated in that, and they were all capped out at, $13, $14 million if they reached the maximum. So that hasn't changed. I think the super PAC part of it has really changed the landscape, and will continue to change the landscape when it comes to campaigning.
I will just note a couple things. That 121 million or whatever figure it is also a little misleading. Not to say that money is not a big issue, but you did have 11 candidates or 10 candidates, whatever it was. So I think that had a little bit to do with raising that overall number. Baraka's people who I spoke to yesterday said that they had about 5% of that big pot. And a lesser candidate would have been in 5th place, I think. So to me, that makes me feel like anybody could raise money now, because I can get my wife or my cousin Vinny to start this PAC that I don't coordinate with, to raise money for me to run for mayor or whatever it is that I'm running for next year. But at the same time, if you're not a good candidate, all that money's going to do is show that you're not a good candidate. And so that's the double-edged sword of that. And really, you can raise unlimited amounts of money. I mean, it's just that simple. Matching funds from the state and limits imposed as a result of that, be damned, because I really feel like in a few cycles, we're going to see celebrity candidates or more celebrity candidates. Someone who's big in Jersey, who says, you know what, as a vanity project, I want to run for governor. And that person is able to attract so much money because of their Hollywood friends or whatever industry they happen to be in. And so does that make the process better? I'm not sure. I'm also, and I'll add a cynical note here, and apologize in advance. I'm not sure that voters have met our hopes for them being more discerning and more educated about candidates. I think that by and large, we're waiting till the last few days of the campaign to ask, oh, is election day this week? So I think if the candidates were required when they got public financing to dedicate some of that to voter education, that might be a good thing, a little something to throw in there as a requirement for receiving public funds. But I think voters got to step up their game a little bit too. It's one thing to like your guy, but it's quite another thing to vote for things that are of importance and significance to you and your community. And I don't think that people do that. That's how they sometimes elect a guy like Donald Trump, voting literally against their own self-interest. And so voters got to step it up a little, I think.
The question we kept asking the whole time, are people paying attention yet, right? Which we kept saying, no, not really, not yet. I know we're coming up on time here, but I want to get 2 more questions in fairly quickly. One which is sort of a broad question, but I think an interesting one, which is what are the pros and cons of Jersey holding off-year elections? Does the public get tired of having elections every year? Is part of the question. But essentially the question is, we mentioned it in New Jersey, Virginia, the only 2 gubernatorial races this year. It's not a midterm, it's not a presidential. What's good about that? What's bad about that?
It gets us a lot of national attention, which we
Which
would
is
not
good and
otherwise
bad, right?
get. I think it's probably beneficial for Democrats not to be on an off year, because they are a majority still in the state, and at the national level, the Democrats do still win in the state. I know there were some questions about how close this last election was, but there were a lot of variables at play there. I don't know that you can really project onto that. So I suspect that if we were to hold a constitutional convention and move to a voting on the even years, that would be beneficial for Democrats. Whether it's good for the state or not, I will not opine on, but
I mean, I feel like we're always suffering from voter fatigue. I feel like we end one campaign cycle and then we got to start talking about the next one. There's always some election churning. And I think voters would like a little bit more of a regulated process that didn't force them to have to think about this when they got to figure out how to do all the other stuff to live in this state. So, you know, I'm ending on cynical notes, and I apologize.
That's okay. Some information fatigue too, I think, out there, but difficult to fight through. Another question that came in was sort of tracked with the last question that I wanted to ask, which was in part just to point out that Mikey Sherrill would become the second woman elected governor of New Jersey if she were to win, the first Democratic woman to serve as governor. And I believe, if I'm not mistaken, she's the second woman to win a Democratic primary for governor, so the second woman to be nominee for governor. What role do you think gender plays as we get to the fall race? My sense is that it probably won't be an explicit role, but certainly our research here shows that, particularly in gubernatorial races, that the gender is always involved once you get to particularly the general election. So I'd be curious to get any of your thoughts on the role gender plays in this race, and particularly, Mikey Sherrill being the only woman of the 11 who was in the primary as well.
I'll mention the last Democratic Party woman and only Democratic Party woman who ran for governor, Barbara Buono, who had the misfortune of running against Chris Christie during the height of his popularity. She famously said on election night that we took one for the team. Unfortunately, we learned that there was no team. And I think that, I mean, that still resonates with me. I don't know how many years later, but I think it's a challenge in New Jersey for female candidates on the biggest stage to get even the support of their own party. I think that, what we saw in the national election, the misogyny and sexism that were underlying in that election could well be the case in New Jersey again. And I'm not saying that it is, or I'm not predicting that it is, but I think it's something certainly that has to be considered. And it's important, I think, for Jack Ciattarelli to not be a dude, which he can sometimes come across as, a dude. And I think that that's a challenge going forward. But also, Mikey Sherrill, for better or worse, has the responsibility of, representing all women, whether she wants to carry that mantle or not. So, but again, it depends on what other stuff is happening. I think that becomes a question absent some other overriding issue.
so we had, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead, Missy.
Oh, please, no.
So we've had a terrible history of electing women, as you pointed out. We've had one female governor, no female senators. I think 2/3 of all states have had a female senator, and a bunch have had two at the same time. We've had fewer than 10 women in Congress in the 100 years that women have voted. So it's not a good record. The only encouraging thing, I guess, to the degree that machines and county organizations still matter, is unlike Barbara Buono, who was thrown under the bus by the team, which aligned itself with Christie, i.e. the Democratic Party organizations that were working very closely with Christie and did absolutely nothing to help her win. It does seem like Sherrill has the support of the county organizations. So it may be a different race, and it may be more about, the broader environment, as David pointed out, or just the kind of candidate that she turns out to be.
Yeah, I would agree. Having worked at Barbara Bono's campaign, she wasn't the candidate that the party wanted. So though she won the primary, it was, she wasn't the candidate they wanted. So the support wasn't there. And that is not the case for Sherelle. But it is going to be important that she has a coalition of women voters coming out in large numbers, because that obviously helps women to win. And I don't think it's a given that she will. So that's for her, it's not a demographic that she should forego and make any assumptions about the fact that she will get them. So we look forward, obviously, as an operative on the Democratic side, to putting together the plans to make sure that doesn't happen. But ultimately, she's going to have to put the work in to get women. And when I say coalition, I mean women of various demographics, economic statuses to support her. Because if I am correct, I believe when Whitman won, that's what she got. She got a coalition. Democratic women supported her even. And that's what we're going to need to see happen for Mikey to win as well.
I think David alluded to it. I think it's hard for both of them, right? For both candidates, right? I mean, she wants to be judged and supported based on who she is, what she's accomplished. And gender will come up from time to time. And, she needs to acknowledge that, but that, she's running, as a qualified candidate for the Democratic nomination for governor. At the same time, Chitterelli, has to talk about himself, and as David said, not be a dude. And I've seen it at the local level, men and women compete against each other, and it's you don't want to be a dude, I guess. I like that, David. I'm going to be repeating that several times. You don't want to say something that could be misconstrued. And in this day and age, something that you just say could be misconstrued as anti female, right? So it's I think it's going to be it's difficult for both of them in terms of how they want to project themselves, and then navigate the gender politics of it.
It's one thing to say something that's impolitic, but it's quite another thing to project that sensibility. And I think that resonates more than him calling her sweetheart or something like that. If he presents a point of view or a stance that belies what he wants to project, I think that resonates a lot more with voters than any verbal.
But as you know, David, it's even if you're saying something that 8 of us would think is neutral, somebody else could take it a different way. And with social media, can you believe he said it this way? It's
for sure.
They both have that challenge.
Our tolerance level is very different than it used to be as it relates to that, because of Trump, who says things all the time. So that people in Citarelli's party are okay with or just ignore and proceed accordingly. So he has probably some leeway. I anticipate that he is more sophisticated than that, but could get away with more just based on where his party seems to be at this time. And she clearly is making it clear that she's a woman in a race. Much of her campaign is about, her profile as a mother and as a fighter. So, which I think is a good thing. And it's, something that is different than what we've seen. And it is something that can help her move out of kind of seeming like the status quo, because it isn't the status quo.
And it undoubtedly was a factor, I think, in the primary, because she stood out, right, as the only woman in the race. So.
Well, it should be a very interesting race. Any final thoughts? Anything that you wanted to be sure to bring up that I didn't get to because I didn't ask the right question?
I think you asked great questions, Chris.
Agreed.
Well, I had one job. It was to get us out of here on time, and I failed at that. But I thank you all so much. I will say my final thought is just that, we mentioned 1981 a couple times. It's the last time sort of being this interesting primary. I'll note that coming out of that primary, the Republican nominee was a well-known state politician. The Democratic nominee was a member of the House of Representatives. And we ended up with the closest general election in New Jersey history. So whether history sort of repeats itself in that way again, history doesn't repeat itself, but sometimes it rhymes, right? So we'll see if my guess is that we're going to have another close race this November, and certainly one that we'll all be paying close attention to. So I hope that you will all come along with us. But I thank you all very much for your time this morning. This has been terrific. You all are fantastic. And I look forward to continuing to speak with all of you as we go through this race. And to everyone watching, I hope that you'll stay engaged. I hope that you'll make your plans to vote in November, and wish you all a wonderful rest of this beautiful day.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.